The rusty metal door of Lincoln High's forgotten storage room creaked open with the enthusiasm of a dying whale. Jake Martinez kicked a cardboard box aside, his sneakers squeaking against the dusty concrete floor like angry mice. Behind him, three figures shuffled through the doorway, each carrying the distinctive slouch of students who'd rather be literally anywhere else. Remind me again why we are spelunking through the school's reject collection. Zoe Park muttered, pulling cobwebs from her dark hair with the precision of someone who'd given up on personal hygiene hours ago. Tommy Nakamura adjusted his thick-rimmed glasses, squinting through the dim light filtering through a grimy window. Because our collective GPA is circling the drain faster than Jake's dating prospects. Hey, Jake protested, though his indignation lacked conviction. Hard to argue with facts when your last 3 attempts at asking someone to prom resulted in restraining order threats. Riley Singh, the 4th member of their academic disaster squad, poked at a moldy textbook with her boot. My parents are threatening military school if I don't pass Mr. Henderson's history exam. Do you know what they do to kids like me in military school? They make us wake up before noon. The horror in her voice was genuine. Jake surveyed their surroundings with the critical eye of someone desperately seeking miracles in mundane places. Cardboard boxes stacked like ancient monuments, forgotten science equipment gathering dust like archaeological artifacts, and enough outdated technology to stock a museum dedicated to humanity's questionable life choices. There's got to be something useful in here, Jake insisted, because admitting defeat wasn't in his vocabulary. Admitting anything remotely resembling responsibility, however, had been surgically removed from his personality years ago. Tommy lifted a sheet covering what appeared to be a large metal frame, roughly the size of a doorway, but infinitely more mysterious. The device hummed with the subtle energy of electronics that probably should have been unplugged decades ago. Cables snaked from its base like technological intestines, connecting to a control panel that looked like it had been designed by someone with a serious commitment to making simple things unnecessarily complicated. Well, what we have here? Tommy's voice carried the tone of someone who'd just discovered buried treasure, or at least something worth procrastinating with. Zoe approached the device, her natural skepticism warring with genuine curiosity. Looks like someone's science fair project from the Stone Age. What's with all the buttons and blinking lights? Riley squinted at a faded label barely visible on the control panel. Property of Dr. Angela Kowalski, Theoretical Physics Department. She paused, processing. Wait, didn't she used to teach here before she disappeared mysteriously in the 80s? Define mysteriously, Jake said, because if there was one thing worse than failing history, it was failing history while getting murdered by vengeful spirits. The kind where people whisper about government cover-ups and interdimensional experiments. Tommy replied cheerfully, because apparently mortal danger was preferable to summer school. The device continued its electronic humming, occasionally punctuated by beeps that sounded suspiciously like Morse code for terrible idea ahead. Jake approached the control panel with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a problem he couldn't make worse through sheer determination. How hard can it be? It's just buttons and switches. Famous last words, Zoe observed, though she made no move to stop him. The control panel featured an array of dials, switches, and digital displays that would have challenged NASA engineers. One particular dial caught Jake's attention, labeled with years spanning from ancient history to what appeared to be far future dates. Guys, Jake said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of impending catastrophe, I think this thing is supposed to be some kind of time machine. Riley snorted. Right, and I'm the Queen of Mars. Time travel is impossible, Jake. It violates like 17 laws of physics. 18, actually, Tommy corrected, because accuracy mattered even in the face of the impossible. But theoretical physics suggests that with sufficient energy and the right understanding of space-time manipulation, English Tommy, Zoe interrupted. It might actually work, he finished. The 4 friends stared at the device with the mixed expression of terror and fascination typically reserved for discovering your parents' browser history. Now Jake's finger hovered over what appeared to be a power switch. Think about it. We could go back in time, witness historical events firsthand, take notes, then come back and ace every exam for the rest of our lives. Or we could get stuck in the past and die of dysentery, Riley pointed out, because she was the group's designated voice of reason, a thankless job that paid poorly and offered no benefits. Or get eaten by dinosaurs, Zoe added helpfully. Or cause a temporal paradox that destroys the universe, Tommy contributed, his excitement clearly overriding his survival instincts. Jake grinned with the manic enthusiasm of someone about to make a spectacularly poor life choice. Only one way to find out. He flipped the switch. The device roared to life with all the subtlety of a freight train colliding with a nuclear reactor. Lights flashed in patterns that would have triggered seizures in epileptic Christmas trees. The metal frame began to shimmer, and the air within it rippled like water disturbed by an invisible stone. Through the rippling portal, images began to form. Ancient Egypt, with pyramids under construction and workers who looked suspiciously less enslaved than Hollywood had led them to believe. Medieval castles where knights were dealing with surprisingly modern problems like supply chain management and worker disputes. The American Revolution, complete with founding fathers who were apparently far more sarcastic than history textbooks suggested. Holy crap, Riley whispered, her voice barely audible over the machine's mechanical symphony. It's actually working. Tommy was frantically scribbling notes in a notebook he'd produced from somewhere, his handwriting a chaotic blend of scientific observations and barely contained excitement. The temporal displacement field appears stable. The visual feed is clear. This is incredible. Zoe, meanwhile, was staring at the portal with the expression of someone watching their worldview crumble in real time. We are looking at actual history, like the real deal, not some textbook version or Hollywood interpretation. Jake approached the portal's edge, where the air itself seemed to buzz with possibility. So, who wants to be the first to take a little field trip? Are you insane? Riley demanded, though her tone suggested she was seriously considering the possibility. We don't know if it's safe. We don't know if we can get back. We don't know anything about how this thing works. We know it shows us the past. Jake replied with the logic of someone whose critical thinking skills had been permanently damaged by too much social media. And we know we are all failing our classes. Risk versus reward, people. Tommy looked up from his notes, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of scientific discovery mixed with academic desperation. Actually, if Dr. Kowalski's theories were correct, the temporal field should be bidirectional. We should be able to return to our original time frame. Should being the operative word, Zoe muttered. But even as they debated the wisdom of their actions, the allure of the portal proved irresistible. Here was actual history, unfiltered and unedited, waiting to solve all their academic problems with the efficiency of a cosmic cheat code. Jake made the decision for all of them by stepping through the portal before anyone could stop him. The sensation was like being turned inside out while riding a roller coaster through a blender filled with static electricity. For a moment that lasted either seconds or centuries, Jake existed everywhere and nowhere, experiencing every possible version of himself across infinite timelines. Then he landed face first in what appeared to be ancient Roman dirt, which tasted exactly as appetizing as one might expect. Jake, Zoe's voice echoed from behind him as she tumbled through the portal, followed immediately by Tommy and Riley in various states of temporal disorientation. They found themselves in the middle of what was clearly ancient Rome, though the reality was far different from their preconceptions. The city bustled with activity, but it wasn't the sanitized version from movies. Real Romans dealt with real problems. Traffic jams involving horse-drawn carts, street vendors arguing about exchange rates, and what appeared to be an ancient version of rush hour complete with frustrated commuters. Okay, Riley said, brushing dust from her clothes while trying not to have a complete panic attack. We are in ancient Rome. This is fine. This is totally fine. We are just 4 teenagers from the 21st century standing in the middle of the Roman Empire. Nothing could possibly go wrong. Tommy was already pulling out his phone to record everything, because documentation was apparently more important than survival. The historical accuracy is incredible. Look at the architecture, the clothing, the social dynamics. This is like having a front row seat to civilization. A group of Roman citizens walked past, engaged in animated conversation about what sounded like municipal politics. One of them glanced at the four teenagers with mild curiosity before continuing his discussion about aqueduct maintenance schedules. "They're not paying attention to us," Zoe observed. "Shouldn't we stand out like sore thumbs?" Jake examined their situation with the analytical skills of someone who'd spent years avoiding responsibility. Maybe the portal has some kind of perception filter. Or maybe people in the past were just less observant. Or maybe, Tommy suggested, temporal displacement creates a localized probability field that makes us blend into the historical context. Riley stared at him. "Sometimes I worry about your brain, Tommy." But before anyone could respond, a commotion erupted nearby. A crowd was gathering around what appeared to be a public speaker, and from their position, the four friends could see it was none other than Julius Caesar himself, mid-speech about something that would undoubtedly become historically significant. "We are witnessing history," Jake breathed, his voice filled with awe. "Actual, real history. Mr. Peterson is going to lose his mind when I write about this." Tommy was scribbling frantically, recording every detail with the dedication of someone who'd found their life's purpose. The speech patterns, the crowd reactions, political dynamics, it's all here. We are going to ace every Roman history question for the rest of our academic careers. Zoe, meanwhile, was focused on more practical concerns. How do we get back? The portal isn't exactly subtle, and I don't see it anywhere. They turned to look behind them, and sure enough, the shimmering doorway back to their own time was nowhere to be seen. "Okay," Riley said, her voice climbing toward panic territory. "Please tell me someone has a plan for getting home that doesn't involve waiting 2,000 years. Jake patted his pockets, as if he might have accidentally brought a time machine manual. "The portal should reappear in the same location we arrived. It's probably just invisible, or something." "Invisible time portals," Zoe repeated slowly. "That's your scientific explanation?" "I'm making this up as I go," Jake admitted. "None of us exactly majored in theoretical physics." Tommy looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who just solved a particularly challenging puzzle. "According to Dr. Kowalski's research notes, which I definitely didn't hack from the school's archive files, temporal displacement field operates on preset intervals. We should have approximately 1 hour before the return portal manifests." 1 hour, Riley repeated. 1 hour in ancient Rome. What could possibly go wrong in 1 hour? As if summoned by her question, a group of Roman soldiers rounded the corner, their armor clanking with the authority of people who were professionally trained to solve problems through the application of sharp metal objects. The soldiers' leader, a centurion whose scars suggested he'd won more fights than he'd lost, spotted the four teenagers and approached with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having his questions answered immediately. "Citizens," he said in Latin that somehow translated perfectly in their minds, "you appear to be unusually dressed. Are you performers? Merchants from distant lands?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, realized he had no idea what to say, and settled for the time-honored tradition of letting someone else handle the talking. Tommy stepped forward with the confidence of someone who'd spent years being the smartest person in every room. "We are traveling scholars from the Northern Territories. We have come to observe Roman governance and scholarly pursuits." The centurion studied them with eyes that had seen enough lies to recognize truth when it appeared. "Scholars, you say? What manner of scholarship brings you to Rome dressed in such peculiar garments?" Riley, apparently deciding that honesty was the best policy, opened her mouth to explain about time travel and high school history exams. Zoe quickly elbowed her in the ribs, preventing what would have been either a fascinating cultural exchange or an immediate trip to Roman psychiatric facilities. "We study the customs and clothing of distant peoples," Zoe said smoothly, because apparently she was better at improvisation than any of them had realized. "Our attire represents the fashions of our homeland." The centurion nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense in a world where the Roman Empire encompassed dozens of different cultures with their own unique customs. "Very well," he said. "See that you conduct yourselves appropriately while in Rome." The city has little patience for troublemakers, regardless of their scholarly pursuits. As the soldiers continued their patrol, the four friends released collective sighs of relief. That was close, Riley whispered. Too close, Jake agreed. Maybe we should find somewhere less conspicuous to wait for the portal. Tommy pointed toward what appeared to be a library or scholarly building. There, we can blend in with actual scholars and observe Roman intellectual culture firsthand. They made their way through the crowded streets, dodging horse-drawn carts and street vendors while trying not to stare too obviously at the living, breathing history surrounding them. The sights, sounds, and smells of ancient Rome were overwhelming in their authenticity, far removed from the sanitized versions they'd studied in textbooks. The library, when they reached it, was a revelation. Scrolls lined the walls. Scholars debated philosophical questions with passionate intensity, and the air buzzed with intellectual energy that made their high school's library seem like a morgue by comparison. This is incredible, Tommy breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. Look at the astronomical charts, the mathematical treatises, the philosophical debates. Roman scholarship was far more advanced than most people realize. Jake found himself drawn to a group of young Romans, engaged in what appeared to be an academic discussion. Their Latin was rapid and complex, but somehow his brain was translating it in real time. The temporal displacement field appears to include linguistic translation, Tommy observed, scribbling more notes. We can understand and presumably speak Latin as if it were our native language. Zoe was examining architectural plans spread across a nearby table. Look at these engineering schematics. They're designing aqueducts, roads, and buildings that will last for millennia. The Romans weren't just conquerors. They were incredibly sophisticated engineers and administrators. Riley, meanwhile, had discovered a section devoted to what appeared to be historical records. Guys, these scrolls contain accounts of events that haven't happened yet from our perspective, but are ancient history to us. We could learn about historical events from primary sources, written by people who actually lived through them. The implications were staggering. They weren't just witnessing history. They were accessing the raw materials of historical knowledge, unfiltered by centuries of interpretation and revision. We need to be systematic about this, Jake said, his academic survival instincts finally kicking in. What subjects are we most desperate to pass? All of them, Riley replied honestly. Right, but let's prioritize. History, obviously. Science, because Tommy's failing physics despite being smarter than Einstein. Literature, because Zoe's having issues with classical analysis. Zoe looked up from the architectural plans. And you? Jake grinned sheepishly. Math. Apparently, the ability to charm your way through life doesn't extend to calculus. Tommy had found a scroll containing what appeared to be advanced mathematical concepts. The Romans were far more mathematically sophisticated than most textbooks suggest. Look at these geometric proofs, these algebraic concepts. This could help with your math problems, Jake. And the historical records here could provide primary source material for every history exam we will ever take, Riley added, her excitement overriding her earlier panic. Zoe held up an architectural drawing. Engineering principles that were centuries ahead of their time. The applications for physics and engineering classes are endless. They spent the next 40 minutes immersed in Roman scholarship, taking notes, recording observations, and absorbing information that would have taken months to gather through traditional research. The temporal displacement field seemed to enhance their learning capabilities, allowing them to process and retain information at unprecedented rates. As their allotted time began to run out, they made their way back to the location where they'd first arrived. The streets of Rome continued their bustling activity around them, but the four friends were focused entirely on getting home with their newfound knowledge intact. Tommy pointed to a shimmering distortion in the air that was barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The return portal is manifesting. They approached the temporal gateway with mixture of relief and reluctance. Ancient Rome had been incredible, but the modern world awaited, along with history exams that suddenly seemed far less intimidating. Ready? Jake asked. Ready, they replied in unison, point one by one. They stepped through the portal, experiencing the same inside-out roller coaster sensation as before, and emerged back in Lincoln High's forgotten storage room, surrounded by dusty boxes and the familiar smell of institutional neglect. Did that actually happen? Riley asked, staring at her notebook filled with observations about Roman society. Tommy held up his phone, which showed hours of video footage from ancient Rome. It happened. We actually traveled through time. Zoe examined her sketches of Roman architecture. We have enough material to write doctoral dissertations, let alone pass high school exams. Jake looked at the portal device, which had returned to its dormant state, but continued to hum with potential energy. This is just the beginning. Think about what we could learn if we visited other time periods. Ancient Greece, Renaissance, Italy, the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, the future, Tommy added quietly. They all turned to stare at him. The portal can access future time frames as well as past ones, he explained. We could see scientific discoveries that haven't been made yet, technological advances that are decades or centuries away. The possibilities were endless and terrifying and absolutely irresistible. Riley checked her watch. We should get out of here before someone discovers us. But tomorrow we make history, Jake finished, grinning with the expression of someone who'd just discovered the ultimate cheat code for life itself. Yes, they filed out of the storage room, each carrying notebooks filled with impossible knowledge. None of them noticed the small security camera in the corner, its red recording light blinking steadily in the darkness. Somewhere in the depths of Lincoln High's administrative offices, Principal Davidson watched the security footage with the expression of someone whose day had just become infinitely more complicated. Principal Davidson sat in his office at 6:30 in the morning, nursing his third cup of coffee and staring at security footage that defied every law of physics he'd learned in his abandoned engineering degree. For students had somehow turned his school's storage room into what appeared to be a functioning time machine, complete with actual temporal displacement and historical tourism. He rubbed his temples, wondering if administrative stress had finally driven him to hallucinations, or if Lincoln High had somehow become ground zero for the most elaborate senior prank in educational history. The intercom buzzed. Mr. Davidson? The Martinez boy and his friends are here to see you. Davidson looked at the frozen frame on his monitor, showing Jake Martinez stepping through what was clearly a portal to ancient Rome. Send them in. Jake, Zoe, Tommy, and Riley filed into the office with the unified expression of students who knew they were in trouble but weren't quite sure how much trouble. Their backpacks bulged with notebooks containing impossible knowledge, and their eyes held the shell-shocked look of people who'd had their understanding of reality fundamentally reorganized. Sit, Davidson said simply. They Saturday for a long moment, principal and students regarded each other across the desk, engaged in the kind of strategic silence that preceded either understanding or expulsion. So, Davidson finally said, turning his monitor so they could see the security footage, anyone want to explain why my storage room appears to have become a gateway through time? Jake opened his mouth, realized he had no plausible explanation that didn't sound insane, and closed it again. Tommy, being the group's designated expert on impossible situations, cleared his throat. Theoretically speaking, if someone were to discover a functional temporal displacement device in a school storage room, and if that someone were failing multiple classes due to inadequate study resources, and if that someone had access to primary historical sources through said temporal displacement, English, Mr. Nakamura, we found a time machine and used it to cheat on our homework, Tommy finished miserably. Davidson nodded slowly, as if this explanation made perfect sense in the context of modern education. And the machine belongs to Dr. Angela Kowalski, who disappeared from this school in 1987 under circumstances that the government classified faster than you can say national security. Riley's eyes widened. You knew about the machine? I have been principal here for 15 years, Davidson replied. You think I don't know every piece of equipment in my building? That device has been sitting in storage since before any of you were born, waiting for someone either brilliant enough or stupid enough to turn it on. Zoe found her voice. Are you going to expel us? Davidson leaned back in his chair, studying them with the calculating expression of someone weighing options. That depends. What exactly did you learn during your little field trip to the Roman Empire? Jake pulled out his notebook, still somewhat stunned that they weren't being immediately punished. Roman political structure, engineering principles, military organization, economic systems, social hierarchies, and enough primary source material to revolutionize historical scholarship. In 1 hour, Tommy added, the temporal field enhanced our cognitive processing and retention capabilities. We absorbed information at approximately 50 times normal rates. Davidson's eyebrows rose. 50 times, conservative estimate, Riley said, producing her own notes. We documented everything. Political speeches by Julius Caesar, engineering specifications for aqueducts, military tactical discussions, philosophical debates that never made it into historical records. Davidson stood and walked to his window, looking out at the school parking lot where students were arriving for another day of traditional education. Do you have any idea what you have stumbled into? A really effective study aid? Jake suggested hopefully. A fundamental disruption of the educational system, Davidson corrected. If students can travel through time to gather information directly from primary sources, what happens to traditional learning? What happens to teachers, textbooks, research methods? The four friends exchanged glances, realizing they'd been so focused on passing their exams that they hadn't considered the broader implications of their discovery. Tommy frowned. We didn't think about the systemic ramifications. No, you didn't, Davidson agreed. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes the most important discoveries happen when people aren't thinking about consequences. He returned to his desk and opened a locked drawer, retrieving a folder marked with government seals and security classifications that made their eyes widen. Dr. Angela Kowalski, Davidson began, was recruited by the Department of Defense in 1987 to develop temporal reconnaissance technology. Her research was so advanced that it scared government officials who usually weren't scared by anything. They shut down her project and classified everything, but Dr. Kowalski had already hidden her prototype here at Lincoln High. Riley leaned forward. Why here? Because she believed that temporal technology belonged to everyone, not just military organizations. She hid the device where curious minds might eventually find it and use it for learning rather than warfare. Davidson opened the folder, revealing photographs, technical specifications, and documents that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies rather than high school administrative files. The government has been looking for this machine for 37 years, he continued. They know it's somewhere in this school, but they have never been able to locate it. Dr. Kowalski's security measures were comprehensive. Jake stared at the technical documents. You are saying we accidentally activated a prototype military time machine that the government has been hunting for decades. That's exactly what I'm saying. Zoe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the school's ancient heating system. What happens when they find out we have been using it? Davidson closed the folder and locked it back in his drawer. That depends on what we do next. The intercom buzzed again. Mr. Davidson, there are some federal agents here to see you. They say it's about irregularities in the school's electromagnetic signature. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. They are here, Tommy whispered. Davidson stood with the calm determination of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for years. Storage room. Now, all of you. They raced through the hallways, Davidson leading the way with surprising speed for someone who spent most of his time behind a desk. Students pressed against lockers as the principal and four panicked teenagers charged through the corridors like academic fugitives. The storage room door slammed behind them as Davidson activated locks that seemed far more sophisticated than standard school security. The time machine hummed with readiness, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The government agents will search the school systematically, Davidson explained, rapidly inputting commands into the device's control panel. They have equipment that can detect temporal energy signatures, but only if the machine is inactive. If you are using it, traveling through time, the readings become untraceable. Riley stared at him. You want us to run away through time? I want you to continue Dr. Kowalski's work, Davidson replied. Learn everything you can. Document everything. Prove that temporal technology can be used for education and discovery rather than military applications. Jake looked at the portal, which was already beginning to shimmer with potential destinations. Where do we go? Tommy was studying the control panel, his fingers dancing over settings with newfound understanding. Anywhere, everywhere. We have access to all of human history and beyond. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Renaissance Italy, Davidson suggested quickly. Leonardo da Vinci's workshop. You will find scientific principles there that won't be officially discovered for centuries. Zoe grabbed extra notebooks from the storage shelves. What about you? I will handle the federal agents. Davidson replied with a smile that suggested he'd been looking forward to this confrontation for years. Dr. Kowalski left me certain resources for dealing with government overreach. The footsteps stopped outside the storage room door. Go, Davidson urged. Learn everything. Change everything. Show the world what temporal technology can really accomplish. Tommy adjusted the portal settings to Renaissance Italy, 1503. The air within the frame rippled, revealing Leonardo da Vinci's workshop in incredible detail. They could see the master himself, working on what appeared to be designs for a flying machine, while simultaneously sketching human anatomy and calculating mathematical equations. This is insane, Riley breathed. This is education, Jake corrected, stepping toward the portal. Real education. One by one, they stepped through into Renaissance Italy, leaving behind the 21st century and entering an age of discovery that would make their previous Roman adventure seem like a warm-up exercise. The sensation of temporal displacement was becoming familiar, though no less disorienting. They materialized in Leonardo's workshop just as the great inventor was explaining mechanical principles to a group of students who would have given anything to understand half of what he was demonstrating. Magnificent, Tommy whispered, immediately beginning to document everything. Look at the integration of art, science, and engineering. Leonardo wasn't just an artist or an inventor. He was synthesizing entire fields of knowledge decades before they were officially established. Leonardo glanced up from his work, noticed the four newcomers, and returned to his explanations without missing a beat. The temporal field apparently made their presence seem natural to historical figures, allowing them to observe and learn without disrupting the timeline. Zoe was fascinated by the artistic techniques being demonstrated. He's showing how mathematics and geometry inform aesthetic beauty, the connection between scientific principles and artistic expression. Riley found herself drawn to Leonardo's anatomical studies, medical knowledge that was centuries ahead of its time. He's dissecting cadavers and making discoveries about human physiology that won't be accepted by mainstream medicine for decades. Jake, meanwhile, was watching Leonardo work on mechanical designs that looked suspiciously like prototypes for modern technology. Flying machines, tanks, submarines, automatic machinery. He's inventing the future. For 3 hours, they immersed themselves in Renaissance learning, absorbing not just facts and techniques, but entire approaches to knowledge that integrated multiple disciplines in ways their modern education system had forgotten. When a return portal finally manifested, they stepped back through to find Davidson waiting for them with a satisfied expression and no federal agents in sight. "How did it go?" he asked. "Incredible," they replied in unison, their notebooks now filled with insights that could revolutionize multiple fields of study. "And the government agents?" Tommy asked. Davidson smiled mysteriously. "Let's just say that Dr. Kowalski's security measures included more than just hiding the machine. Turns out federal agents have a difficult time remembering why they came to investigate a school when exposed to certain electromagnetic frequencies." Jake stared at him. "You mind-wipe federal agents?" "I encourage them to reconsider their priorities," Davidson corrected diplomatically. Over the following weeks, the four friends established a routine. Mornings in class, afternoons traveling through time. They visited ancient Greece to study with Aristotle, observed Galileo's astronomical discoveries, witnessed the Industrial Revolution, and even ventured into the future to see scientific advances that wouldn't occur for decades. Their academic performance didn't just improve, it transcended anything their teachers had ever seen. Jake's mathematical understanding exploded after studying with ancient Babylonian astronomers and future quantum physicists. Tommy's physics knowledge expanded through direct observation of scientific discoveries across centuries. Zoe's writing improved dramatically after conversations with Shakespeare, Dickens, and authors who wouldn't be born for another 100 years. Riley's historical understanding became so sophisticated that her teachers suspected her of plagiarism until they realized she was citing primary sources that existed only in restricted academic archives. But their success attracted attention. Dr. Margaret Foster, the district's superintendent of curriculum development, arrived at Lincoln High with questions that made Davidson nervous and observations that made the four friends realize their secret was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Principal Davidson, Dr. Foster said, reviewing test scores that defied statistical probability, I need to understand how four previously failing students have suddenly achieved perfect scores in subjects ranging from ancient history to theoretical physics. Davidson maintained his diplomatic smile. Effective tutoring, I believe, tutoring that enabled Jake Martinez to write a mathematical proof that graduate students would struggle with, tutoring that allowed Tommy Nakamura to describe quantum mechanical principles that weren't covered in our curriculum, tutoring that gave Zoe Park insights into literary techniques that required doctoral-level analysis. The four friends exchanged worried glances from their seats in Davidson's office. Dr. Foster opened her briefcase and produced documentation that made their hearts sink. I have been investigating similar anomalies across the country. Students with impossible knowledge, schools with unexplained electromagnetic readings, educational achievements that suggest access to information sources that shouldn't exist. Tommy cleared his throat. Ma'am, we had just been studying really hard. Dr. Foster smiled with the expression of someone who'd heard every possible excuse during 30 years in education. Mr. Nakamura, yesterday you submitted a physics paper that referenced experimental results from the Large Hadron Collider that haven't been published yet. You described quantum experiments that are currently classified at the highest levels of government security. The room fell silent. Riley Singh, Dr. Foster continued. Your history essay included quotes from a speech by Winston Churchill that historians agree was never recorded. You somehow obtained transcript-level accuracy of conversations that took place in private meetings during World War II. Riley squirmed in her chair. Zoe Park, your literary analysis included insights into Shakespeare's writing process that could only come from direct observation. You described his creative methods with the accuracy of someone who had actually watched him work. Zoe stared at her hands. And Jake Martinez, Dr. Foster finished. Your mathematical work shows understanding of principles that suggest exposure to advanced civilizations' approaches to numerical theory. Jake opened his mouth, realized he had no explanation that wouldn't sound completely insane, and closed it again. Dr. Foster leaned back in her chair. Gentlemen, ladies, I believe you have discovered something that could revolutionize human education. The question is what we do about it. Davidson straightened. Dr. Foster, I'm not sure what you are implying. I'm implying that these four students have somehow gained access to primary historical sources, advanced scientific knowledge, and educational resources that transcend our current understanding of what's possible. She paused. I'm also implying that I want in. The silence stretched for several seconds. Excuse me. Riley finally managed. Doctor. Foster smiled with genuine excitement. I've spent my entire career trying to improve education, searching for methods that could help students truly understand rather than just memorize. If you have found something that works, something that can give students direct access to knowledge, then we need to study it, refine it, and find ways to make it available to everyone. Davidson and the four students exchanged glances, realizing that their secret was about to become significantly less secret. Tommy, being the group's expert on impossible situations, spoke first. Theoretically, if such educational resources existed, and if they could be accessed safely and ethically, what would you propose? Dr. Foster opened her briefcase again and produced planning documents that suggested she'd been thinking about this possibility for longer than any of them had realized. A pilot program, she said. Carefully selected students, controlled access, comprehensive documentation. We proved that temporal educational technology can work safely and effectively, then gradually expand access while maintaining appropriate safeguards. Jake frowned. What about the government agents who have been looking for the technology? What government agents? Dr. Foster asked innocently. My records show no federal investigations at Lincoln High. Sometimes electromagnetic anomalies turn out to be perfectly explainable equipment malfunctions. Davidson smiled, recognizing a kindred spirit in educational innovation. There would be conditions, Dr. Foster continued. Complete documentation of all temporal interactions. Safety protocols that prevent historical disruption. Academic oversight to ensure the technology serves educational rather than personal purposes. Riley looked at her friends, seeing the same mixture of excitement and apprehension in their eyes. We'd be pioneers in temporal education. You'd be revolutionizing human learning, Dr. Foster corrected. Imagine students studying physics directly with Einstein, learning literature from Chaucer, understanding history from people who actually lived it. Tommy was already scribbling notes about potential applications. Controlled access could prevent timeline disruption while maximizing educational benefit. We could establish protocols for safe temporal interaction. Zoe nodded slowly. And we could make sure the technology is used for learning and discovery rather than military applications. Jake grinned with the expression of someone who just realized that their academic salvation could become something much more significant. Dr. Kowalski wanted temporal technology to belong to everyone. This could be how we make that happen. Dr. Foster stood and extended her hand. Partners in the future of education. They shook hands, sealing an agreement that would change not just their lives, but the fundamental nature of human learning. 6 months later, the Lincoln High Temporal Education Initiative had become a model program studied by universities worldwide. Students from across the country applied for the opportunity to study history with historical figures, learn science from the greatest minds in human history, and explore literature with the authors who created it. The four friends had become something they'd never expected: teachers. They trained new students in temporal safety protocols, guided historical expeditions, and documented discoveries that filled academic journals with revolutionary insights. Jake had developed mathematical theorems through collaboration with ancient and future mathematicians. Tommy had written physics papers that synthesized knowledge across centuries of scientific discovery. Zoe had produced literary analyses that transformed understanding of classical works. Riley had compiled historical accounts that provided unprecedented accuracy about past events. But their greatest achievement was proving that temporal technology could serve humanity's highest aspirations rather than its darkest impulses. That on a quiet afternoon, as they prepared for another expedition to study with Marie Curie in her laboratory, Jake reflected on how far they'd come from four failing students desperate to pass their exams. You know, he said, adjusting the portal settings, we started this just trying to cheat on our homework and ended up revolutionizing education, Zoe added, checking her equipment. Tommy smiled as he reviewed their safety protocols. Sometimes the best discoveries happen when you're trying to solve a completely different problem. Riley shouldered her pack, filled with recording equipment and notebooks. Dr. Kowalski would be proud. We turned her temporal technology into exactly what she hoped it could become. As they stepped through the portal into Marie Curie's laboratory, beginning another day of impossible education, none of them noticed the small plaque Davidson had installed outside the storage room. Dr. Angela Kowalski Memorial Temporal Education Center, dedicated to the principle that all knowledge belongs to humanity, and that the greatest discoveries come from curious minds willing to explore the impossible. The future of human learning had begun with 4 teenagers too stubborn to accept failure, and it would continue with every student brave enough to step through time in search of understanding. In the end, they hadn't just found a way to pass their exams, they'd found a way to pass knowledge itself from one generation to the next, across all of time and space, ensuring that human discovery would never again be limited by the constraints of any single moment in history. The greatest cheat code ever discovered turned out to be curiosity itself.